This is the Body Wise podcast. Thank you for joining Laura and Christina for another intimate exploration of collective wisdom.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Body Wise podcast. This is Laura, and I'm going to be your host today. I'm very excited because it's my first time hosting the podcast on my own, and there will be no guests today. We will be having a casual conversation between friends, is kind of how I envision this going today. So for those of you who don't know me, I am a fertility and sexual health coach. And I have a website called lovemycycle.com, and I work with people who menstruate around charting their cycles, using a method to avoid getting pregnant, or for couples who are on a fertility journey and they want to become pregnant, as well as the energetics of the different phases of your cycle if you really want to deepen your relationship with your hormonal cycle. So I think today what I would like to do for this time that we have together is to hone in on some just basic vital information around our fertility. Specifically because so many of the people that have been coming into my world recently are people who are on a fertility journey and who are really struggling to conceive and reset their expectations around fertility and conception after years and years of being on hormonal birth control. And it's obviously frustrating for them at this point because they feel like they were not properly informed when they did get on birth control. They weren't given the information that painted the whole picture around what the side effects and risks and consequences of long-term birth control are back then, in the meantime, and now. And in many cases, they are back again at the doctor's office faced with decisions around more medication and fertility treatments and complicated procedures. So that being said, I think that it's very important for people, for all people, to understand menstrual cycles, because it's the first step in appreciating our menstrual cycles. If you don't understand it, you can't appreciate it. And if you don't appreciate it, you can't protect it. And in our society, we are raised to know very little to nothing about our menstrual cycles and our fertility. And in that space of lack, we become deeply vulnerable to outside influences, to what the media represents, to what our doctors suggest and represent. You know, we all of a sudden begin internalizing these messages that have very, very little to do with the reality of our menstrual cycles and our bodies and our experiences. So, in order to change that, it really begins with ourselves. And it begins with owning that knowledge, owning that education around our own bodies and trusting it and living it. So I think one of the basic, most fundamental missing pieces of our experience is getting the basic anatomy and physiology of a menstrual cycle. So I want to share that with you today. I just want to talk through it, like just talk through a menstrual cycle, okay? Okay. So when you see your period, the first day that you're bleeding, that's considered day 1 of your cycle. Your hormone levels are their lowest, and that is why you're bleeding, and you'll come to understand that as I go on. Your hypothalamus, which is located in your brain, is kind of like this overseeing conductor. Like if your body is the symphony and your hormones and everything that all body functions are the instruments and the musicians, the hypothalamus in your brain is the conductor of all of that. And it becomes aware of those low hormone levels. So it will trigger the pituitary gland, which is a primary endocrine gland. It produces hormones in your brain to release follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. Okay, so let's look at that name, follicle stimulating hormone. What the heck is a follicle? Well, you may know your ovaries have eggs inside. And that's kind of the term we think of, an egg, an ovum, an egg, it lives in the ovaries. All of those little ovums in your ovaries are encased in follicles. So let's say a follicle is a fluid-filled sac, and floating inside that little fluid-filled sac is an egg. And there's lots of them in your ovaries. So follicle stimulating hormone travels through your bloodstream down to your ovaries and triggers some follicles to begin maturing, to begin ripening and preparing to potentially one of those follicles, the one that becomes the dominant follicle, and there will be a dominant one in either ovary, just one though, it will be the one that ovulates. So as those follicles are ripening and maturing, and that dominant follicle takes hold, it emits very high levels of estrogen. Okay, so many of us have heard of estrogen. And what does estrogen do? Estrogen will activate your fertility. And how? How does it do that? Okay, well, there are some biological signs in your body that will tell you when your estrogen levels are pretty high. And the primary fertility biosignal is that you'll begin to see cervical mucus. Cervical mucus is a vaginal secretion. And you may have seen it. Like, I remember seeing it when I was in high school and not knowing what the heck it was. And quite frankly, being a little disappointed and kind of grossed out because I didn't know what it was. And I didn't know what to expect. And it didn't fit the bill in terms of what was expected of people with my body to have coming out of them. But that's a whole other thing. So cervical mucus can look like that slippery, stretchy, sometimes egg white or creamy. It changes, it has a changing pattern as your estrogen levels rise. It can first look like a little whitish, yellowish, creamy, and then it gets a little more slippery and it has that stretch to it towards the end. It can look really clear, like I said, almost like egg whites. And that's produced by your cervix. Your cervix is the bottom portion part of your uterus. And that cervix kind of sits in that upper portion of your vaginal canal. So if you were to insert a clean finger up into your vaginal canal, you would touch and feel the cervix. And depending on your hormone levels, the cervix may feel really kind of firm, like the tip of your nose, like that bony part, or it may feel soft. If estrogen levels are high, the cervix softens and it even opens up a little bit to allow cervical fluid to flow, as well as to potentially allow sperm to enter. So you can consider yourself fertile when you observe cervical fluid. Now, what I'm sharing here is not so that you start using this information to prevent pregnancy. Please don't do that. There is a whole set of rules. I use something called the symptothermal method, also known as the fertility awareness method of birth control. And this is some of the body literacy, just basic understanding of your body and your fertility. It is not a method in itself. So moving forward, your cervix opens and softens, cervical mucus is being secreted, and that's a signal to you that ovulation is impending, because when that estrogen level in your body gets high enough, it signals your brain, it signals the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus at that point will release luteinizing hormone, LH. So luteinizing hormone travels down to your ovaries and it will trigger ovulation. It will trigger ovulation. So that dominant follicle will rupture, and out comes an egg. And that egg is swept up by the fimbria, these little tendril-like, kind of finger-like forms at the end of your uterine tube, and it sweeps it into the uterine tube. And that egg remains viable for 12 to 24 hours. That's it. That egg is viable for fertilization up to 24 hours, at which point it disintegrates and is reabsorbed by the body. That's it. That was ovulation. So something really important that LH came to do, that luteinizing hormone, is that little fluid-filled sac, that follicle shell that remains back in the ovary hanging out, that was like the dominant one, it is going to be luteinized. It's a whole transformation, and it becomes this little endocrine gland, and it produces progesterone at high levels. It will still continue to produce estrogen as well, but progesterone will be the dominant hormone during the second half of your cycle. And this corpus luteum, that's the name of it. It's Latin for yellow body, so it actually looks yellow now. This corpus luteum that produces progesterone, it has a very specific lifespan, between 11 to 16 days, and then it will expire. And usually from person to person, it has a really consistent lifespan. For example, mine is 12 days, and it's always 12 days. I think in the last couple of years, I had a 13-day luteal phase, but it's going to be really consistent for me for the most part. And maybe somebody else's is like 16 days, and it's always 16 days, you know? So our cycle lengths may be different, but the point is that it's 11 to 16 days, and then it expires. And when it expires, it no longer produces those high levels of estrogen and progesterone. So with those hormone levels dropping, your endometrial lining sheds. Now, what was happening to the endometrial lining during that whole, like, well, estrogen is rising, and then you ovulate, and then progesterone? It's building. As soon as estrogen starts rising during the first half of your cycle, and your period has dried up, and you're not seeing blood anymore, it's already starting to rebuild. It quickly begins to rebuild with rising estrogen levels. It's like your body doesn't miss a beat, okay? It goes from one cycle into the next, into the next, and into the next. So once you've shed, you are rebuilding. And estrogen produces tissue. It grows tissue. It is a growth hormone. And then progesterone kind of makes that tissue more complex. It creates blood supply. It builds capillaries in order to sustain it and nourish it, just in case the egg is fertilized and conception occurs. Once that egg travels down the fallopian tube and into the uterus, that it can implant, and it's prepared. So progesterone does that. Progesterone really creates a nourishing lining, an environment for that potentially fertilized egg. If that egg wasn't fertilized, like I said, the hormone levels drop once that corpus luteum expires, and you shed the lining of your you shed the lining of your uterus. Your cycle has just ended, and a new one has just begun. So that's like a little mini anatomy and physiology of our cycles. Let's see, something else that's kind of fun to add into that. When your estrogen levels are high, your basal body temperature is going to be lower. Estrogen cools our body down. And when you're producing progesterone during the second half of your cycle, your basal body temperature is going to be higher. You are going to be warmer, okay? It increases your metabolic rate. And it's something that you can measure by taking your temperature. So people, you may have heard, oh yeah, there's some kind of like fertility method and people take their temperature. Well, that's what they're measuring. They are measuring their waking temperature. So they will see a difference once they graph it. Half of their cycles will be kind of around right over here, kind of mid, and then boom, once they ovulate, they will see a consistent rise, and it will remain higher than all of the other temperatures in their cycle. They will have a biphasic graph to look at. And in that way, they know for sure that they ovulated. So it's really fascinating because they'll know what hormones are coursing through their body when, which is really fascinating and empowering because our brains change up to 25% throughout our cycle. And it's primarily due to fluctuating estrogen levels. So we use different parts of our brain like differently depending on where in our cycle we are. We have greater spatial awareness when our hormone levels are low. We have really like boosted synaptic connections in our communication and receptiveness, like parts of our brain, when estrogen levels are really high. So when we're fertile, and like it's fascinating to dive into, and I might not have maybe that would be like a whole other podcast episode, because even though we have before ovulation, after ovulation. So we talk about follicular phase, luteal phase. All right. So from your period to ovulation is considered your follicular phase. That's the first half of your cycle. And from ovulation to like the day you bleed, the end of that cycle, the beginning of the next, it's your luteal phase. Those two phases are really dynamic. Okay. And what happens is that in terms of our experience and the levels of hormones that are fluctuating, we've broken that, well, you may see it broken down into 4 phases. The bleeding phase, and that's based on really our experience in our bodies and the hormone levels and what that does for us. And then our follicular phase, which I don't want that to be confusing because you bleed and you kind of ovulate in your follicular phase. But that little middle section where your hormone levels are beginning to rise, but not, your estrogen's not super high and you're not bleeding anymore. So you're not maybe feeling as withdrawn and you're kind of ready to come out of that and start a new cycle and you feel a little more like renewed. That is what's considered your follicular phase. And then there's the fertile phase, your ovulatory phase. You know that once ovulation occurs, it's an event. It's a 24-hour event. But leading up to it, when you're really fertile and you have high levels of estrogen, you're going to have a whole body mind experience, which is going to be different from your luteal phase and from your bleeding phase and all of the above. So we have 4 phases, like dynamic phases that have specific qualities of our cycle. And that's something fun to look at is people use beautiful metaphors to kind of embody these phases and tap into them. You can go as deep into your menstrual cycle as you want. The first one being winter or menstruation, when we are shedding our lining. The second one being spring for our follicular phase, and it's kind of a fresh new beginning. The third one being summer, when we are sultry and fertile and ready to go out. And then the last one being our luteal phase, which is fall and is a little bit more inward, energetically speaking, and actually my favorite phase. So that being said, that's like a level beyond the science and more of a body, mind, spirit, like connection to nature's cycles and how our bodies are a microcosm of the earth, how we cycle through dry phases and wet phases, and so does the earth and even our temperatures, and there's just so much richness there. But back to the science and just empowered education that will serve you when you walk into a doctor's office and when you make choices about your reproductive capacity. Understanding how vital to your overall health and well-being producing estrogen and producing progesterone, like these hormones, these hormones that we make are not the hormones that we ingest when we are on birth control. Progestin is not just spelled differently from progesterone, it is different. And estrogen is something that most people are not given anymore on birth control because it can be very dangerous. So that being said, there is so much to know and understand before you give your power away to a medical health like a medical provider who sells pharmaceuticals. And I want to say that some of the people that have taught me the most in my life and that I love and adore are doctors. They really are, and I have so much love for them. There are good doctors out there. There aren't that many, but there are great ones. And the ones that have gone into it with all their heart, you know, they're inside of a system, an institution that was established centuries ago, and it was established by people with a specific body, and it was for people with that specific body. And so they are catching up. They are trying now to catch up with bodies that are cyclical and different from theirs. And there's a big gap, you know. So in the meantime, it's very important that you know your body, and you know what is best for it and what it needs and what you need. And that's so important when it comes to, okay, maybe you didn't know this before. Now you're coming off of birth control and you want to get pregnant, and you begin to understand how your fertility works, what your fertility biomarkers are. There is no test for the quality of eggs. A lot of people I'm going to test my ovaries. You can test to find out how many eggs you have left, but you cannot test for their quality. However, we do know that you can improve egg quality, which is really fascinating because it takes about 100 days for like a primordial follicle, a tiny little, like what will eventually be a more mature egg, to split cells, grow, and be viable for ovulation. It takes 100 days for that process to occur. And in those 100 days, how you nourish your body is how you're nourishing your follicle. It's going to have everything to do, how you are caring for your body. It's going to affect, and like your environment and your exposure, all of that. Like you can make choices that will optimize and support your ovarian function and ovarian quality, the follicles of that you make and produce. Okay. The mature follicles. We are born with all that we will ever have. Okay. We are born with all the eggs that we will ever have. But the quality of those eggs is going to change depending on our health and our well-being and the choices that we make. So we can improve their quality. It just takes 100 days. And the same goes for people who produce sperm. Spermatogenesis. It takes 100 days for that like sperm to fully mature. And in that process, nutrition, lifestyle, like there's so much that can be done to optimize sperm. So even that can change. And I guess it's not a pill. It doesn't happen just like that. I mean, that expectation wouldn't be fair to set. But it is very possible. It's very possible. And it's important that we know that. Maybe that's not the right choice for you. That's okay. Maybe, you know, IVF or IUI or whatever it is, that is the way to go for you. That is where you feel, that's in terms of your life and your time and your plans. All right. But I want you to know, I want you to have all of the information and all of the choices readily available, and to go into it really understanding your body, because the sensation of having a broken body, the idea, the belief system of having this weak or broken or problematic, complicated body that we've been sold because it's cyclical, because it's not the same every day, because yes, our brain changes from day to day, and you can experience life in a completely different way from one day to the next, but it can actually be a superpower, not a weakness, the way that we've been taught. to hold our bodies. So that's really it. I think ultimately for me, it's all about, oh, my little slogan I put on my Instagram post the other day, like, education before medication. Education before medication. That is actually the way that it should be across the board. But our doctors, they are not educators. Okay, they are medicators. So it's up to us right now. It's up to us to educate ourselves. And once you educate yourself, you are empowered and you move forward in that way and in your choices. And it is transformative and it is life-changing. Absolutely. And I'm going to make sure that my 2 kids, who will eventually menstruate because they're too young right now, but they have ovaries and a uterus, are going to be very well prepared and informed, and hopefully they will love their cycles. I mean, and I'm setting that example for them. So it's not what you say, it's what you do, right? So I'm here for you. I'd love to hear from you just in comments, questions. You can check out, just for straightforward, really like gender inclusive information on menstrual cycles and menstrual health, I post on my Instagram account at love.my.cycle. And I do have a website called lovemycycle.com, and I'm actually currently working on a very special project that's going to be the Cycle Sanctuary. And the Cycle Sanctuary is going to weave in more than anatomy and physiology. It's going to weave in the seasons, the moon, the cycles, like the energetics of the different phases of our cycle, because that's also a really fun part of all of this for me. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next time. Love, love.